Frank was a mover and shaker, and he knew everyone in the industry. And if you wanted to be connected and if you wanted to network, Frank was the guy to get to know.
This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Danny Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the pulse of theatrical exhibition. And in this week's episode, we will be speaking with Larry Etter, Senior Vice President over at Malco Theatres and the recipient of this year's Frank Liberto Award over at CineShow that is taking place next week in Dallas, Texas. This is going to be a nice little preview interview for the big event. Before we head over to Dallas, we're going to be talking about all the movies coming out this weekend and some of the highlights from last weekend at the marketplace with my colleague Chad Kennerk from Box Office Pro. Chad, welcome back. Dog days of summer here at the box office, but we're almost done with August, fortunately.
Yeah, we have a couple more weeks left. Caught Stealing is around the corner. I have a press screening coming up of that. I'm really looking forward to seeing that one. Did you catch anything at the movies this past weekend?
No, I've been meaning to, but it's been difficult, I think, at this point. You've got kids going back into school. I live close to Manhattan University here in the Bronx. I know, Manhattan University in the Bronx, long story. Anyway, I'm close by to the campus, and you have a lot of the students coming back in. So it just feels like everybody's just getting ready to start working for a French company. That also applies. I think a lot of our colleagues are away, and you're just now getting ready, I think, for a busy September and a positive last third of the year. But really, it's been slow days. Baseball's, just slogging along. Rebecca's Mets are finally imploding the way they always do in late August. So that's a traditional part of the year. College football's about to start, which means I get a little bit happier and busier over the weekends. But like you, I think most of the movies that I'm looking forward to aren't going to be coming out until September. But before then, we've got a couple more weekends to finish off this slow month of August at the box office, with one exception, of course, being Weapons, which is just marching its way to the $100 million mark. We expect the movie to get there by the end of this weekend. Weapons will likely become only the fourth film this year to stay at the number one spot at the box office for 3 consecutive weekends. That's what we are expecting from the title in this latest frame, because there's nothing else really opening up, Chad, to compete against it. I'm just going to rattle off these titles and where we're tracking them to give folks an idea of where we're going to end up. We've got the English language dub of Nachos 2 going out in moderate release from A24. We're expecting a weekend between $1 to $2 million there. That's a movie that already made $20 million here in the US when it opened earlier this year. We've got a Relay from Bleecker Street, which I think looks like a really great high concept movie. That's between $1 to $3 million we're expecting from opening weekend. And then finally, from Focus Features, Honey Don't, which we're expecting an underwhelming weekend between 2 to 4 million. The awareness simply isn't there for that title. And unfortunately, the title that directly preceded this one, Drive Away Dolls, which came out last year, I believe, didn't do particularly well at the box office. We're expecting a 3 weekends and PVOD rollout from Focus Features for that one. So really nothing doing here on opening weekends to challenge Weapons for that number one spot.
Yeah, which is a film I still have to catch up with. It's a perfect time to do that.
Yes. How can you have you been spoiled to misery yet, or are you still
No, I'm putting blinders on and marching forward until I can get to it. Yeah.
Good. Well, it's going to be a good weekend to catch up with that and any other title. We've got those specials from Date Night at the Movies happening this weekend, starting on August 22nd. Theaters nationwide are going to have their own little variations on specials and treats that are happening in their own auditoriums. A lot of folks are doing 2-for-1 popcorns, 2-for-1 sodas, 2-for-1 candies. We're also seeing some very limited re-releases. I know The Wedding Singer's coming back. Movies like Trainwreck are coming back for a brief run. The screen counts there are not substantial enough for them to feature in the top 10, obviously. So we are looking at, like I mentioned earlier, only one title, which is Weapons, to gross above $10 million this weekend. We're expecting a weekend tally between $12 and $15 million for the third frame of Weapons. In second place, right now, we're tracking Freakier Friday to finish between 7 and 9 million. And in third place, we've got Fantastic Four from Disney, currently outpacing everything else to finish up in third. That's currently tracking between 4 and 6 million. Get ready for this, Chad. I'm going to say something we probably don't want to hear, but this may end up being the lowest grossing weekend of the year. Now, there are 3 other weekends that took place in Q1 that did particularly poorly. I'm talking about February 28th to March 2nd, March 7th through March 9, and March 14 to March 16. Each of those weekends grossed $52 to $55 million respectively. Unfortunately, that's the range where we're expecting this weekend to end up. I don't know if we avoid having the bad news to break next weekend. I'm saying it was the lowest grossing weekend of the year. If we do or not, likely might come out of the success of a Netflix title, of all things. This won't be reported on to the press for box office numbers, but we are hearing very strong signs of pre-sales for Netflix's K-pop Demon Hunters. In moderate release, this movie could, if they were going to report box office numbers, could very easily break into the top 3, top 4 movies of the weekend, looking like around $4 million from what I'm hearing from folks in exhibition, maybe a little bit more if sales pick up. But it's one of those weekends where the numbers reported to the press are going to tell one story, but then, of course, Netflix coming in with the unreported figures might actually boost this to the mid-50s, low $60 million range. It's going to be a catch-up weekend, a good weekend for a date night at the movies. We had Mike Bowers, the president and CEO of Harkins Theatres, on in the podcast in last week's episode to tell us a little bit about the event and what different folks are doing around it. And that got me thinking, since we're doing all of these efforts for a date night at the movies industry-wide, since you've got a special 2-for-1 ticket special from AMC and Neon for their movie Together that's actually taking place on the days leading up to date night at the movies. So it's a kind of like a weird situation there, but I think it coincides with the National Couples Day. It got me thinking, Chad, we associate our life at the movies with going out on dates at the movies many times. But for the life of me, I can't seem to tell you a good date movie. I guess I'm just not the right person to recommend what a good date movie is. If you were to tell somebody, this is a fantastic date movie, go with your partner to see it, what would you pick?
In terms of something that's out right now to go see?
Anywhere at any point in time. I mean, you can pick right now. I'd say Weapons, because who doesn't want to see that?
Yeah.
I am in the minority of suggesting that for couples, but I think I'm just bad at suggesting date movies, period. I can attest to this. I've had 3 people I've dated have broken up with me after taking them to go see a movie I wanted to go see.
I don't know if I can. I know that my wife and I have had like tons of great date nights at the movies.
My first date actually ever as a human being was at the AMC Sunset Place 24 in Miami, Florida to go see Toy Story 2. So I do have that as like a seminal life moment movie. But no, I mean, after that, I learned, I guess, just through my attachment to this medium, movies that I like don't have to be movies I share. I think that's fine. Yeah, that's no problem at all.
Yeah. Materialist was a great one recently, I would say, in terms of like a date night. That was maybe one of our favorites.
That's actually a good shout. My wife took me to go see it, and we had a great time. Celine Song's good. She's a good date night filmmaker. There we go. We're finding our footing right now. All right. Materialist, go see Past Lives, either of them. Solid date movies, unless, you studied abroad and had a former flame. Maybe don't take them to Past Lives. You might get yourself in a sticky situation in a couple months. That pretty much wraps up, I guess, our news segment, because there's really nothing much to go on. As I said, just dog days of summer here, an underwhelming weekend in front of us, but things are going to be picking up in the month of September, Chad. We've got some updates in terms of pre-sales of movies coming up soon. That September 5th weekend is going to be a much-needed revival at the box office, with The Conjuring Last Rites from Warner Brothers currently tracking to open between $35 and $45 million. And then the big surprise here, the anime release from Crunchyroll, Demon Slayer, My God, I'm not going to try to say this subtitle. I'm just going to say Infinity Castle. That's what we're going with.
Yeah,
Anyway,
good call.
this anime title, Chad, it is blowing up. I mean, sales have been shooting up through the roof nationwide. I think we had this opening at the teens last weekend.
Wow.
After 1 week of pre-sales, we've got this opening between $35 and $45 million. I mean, a 150% bump on our forecasting just based on 1 week's worth of sales. This is going to be one of the biggest movies in September, and I love surprises like this on the calendar.
Yeah, and I think for exhibitors, it's interesting to point out that this is the first in a 3-part trilogy, and it's a final battle of this very hugely popular anime series. So more to come.
Absolutely. Absolutely necessary, needed. We see a rebound at the box office here. The way the year is tracking right now, it's looking like $9.2 to $9.4 billion in the domestic box office, by the way things stand, by the way the schedule looks. Of course, the performance and the holdover performance of a lot of movies in the ensuing weeks will give us a better indication of where we end up this year compared to last year's $9 billion year domestically. That wraps up our news and analysis segment, Chad. Now coming up after the break is my interview with Larry Etter, SVP of Malco Theatres. In this special interview, looking back on his career in light of his new award as the recipient of this year's Frank Liberto Award over at CineShow, which is taking place next week in Dallas, Texas. Please enjoy this conversation coming up right after this commercial break.
Tired of complicated membership programs that don't actually drive revenue? Omniterm's new flexible subscription solution is built specifically for cinemas like yours. Create custom membership tiers to reward customers with complimentary tickets, exclusive concession benefits, member-only discounts, and seamless fee-free transactions. With secure payment processing and automated recurring billing, you can focus on what matters, filling those seats. Ready to boost customer loyalty and recurring revenue? Visit Omniterm.com to transform your theater's membership program today.
And we are here with Larry Etter, Senior Vice President over at Malco Theatres and the recipient of this year's Frank Liberto Award at CineShow. Let's jump right into it because this is an award, as you were telling me right before we started recording, that means a lot to you. Frank Liberto, one of the titans in the concession space of this industry. This award is named after him and his influence, his impact on the business. You knew him personally. Could you go over a little bit of your history with the man himself?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So Frank was a mentor to me, and that's why this award means so much to me. I kind of chuckled when I got a phone call from Charlie Gomez, and he said, that the Roberto family wanted to recognize me with this award. I thought they only gave the award to individuals from Texas. And maybe they got confused or they were drinking too many margaritas because I'm from Tennessee. But no, Frank has been a dear friend and a mentor. The first time I met Frank was 1985 at Show West in Los Angeles, I think. And I realized from the very start that, Frank was a mover and shaker. And he knew everyone in the industry. And if you wanted to be connected and if you wanted to network, Frank was the guy to get to know. And so 1993, I met him at my first NAC board meeting in Atlantic City. I remember it was the Merv Griffin Hotel. And from that point on, we shared a lot of the same principles. We shared a lot of common beliefs. It was our responsibility as leaders to professionalize what I like to call the recreational food service industry.
Well, take me back to the 70s and 80s, because that span of time, this was a very different industry with the standards and practices that you guys used in the F&B space for cinemas.
Yeah, I think, pre-90s specifically, our industry was seen as overpriced, undervalued, where we would go from city to city and overcharge for watered down sodas and trick people into paying too much for popcorn. And Frank and I both had similar philosophies in that, the people that were legitimate weren't getting enough credit for their business acumen and their work in professionalizing a different type of food and beverage operation. And so, yeah, Frank and we shared a lot of stories. Frank was one of those individuals that he didn't just talk, he invested. And all of my colleagues and peers will tell you that the Liberto family consistently sponsors educational seminars. At NAC, they represent and sponsor all of the regional seminars. And so, Frank didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And I kind of believe, kind of the same thing. And so, again, to be recognized with an award in Frank's name, it's really special to me.
Now, of course, those changes that took place in the 90s to professionalize, to raise the standards, to make sure that there were best practices across the industry, as this entire business really started going from a regional local business to a global multinational business. We started those building blocks in the 90s, as you mentioned. What were some of the biggest changes that you saw in that decade from how things used to get done at the beginning of your career?
Well, I think most of it is equipment-wise. Frank was very instrumental in inventing the nachos. And at the time, they sold nacho cheese in number 10 cans, and you would put it in a fudge warmer, in the back of the concession stand, and you had a ladle that you dip into the cheese. And it was just always a mess. It was just cheese everywhere. And at the end of the event, it was baked on. It was gritty and all that. But
it doesn't sound very appetizing, Larry. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so you're asking the right question. So what are some of the changes? Well, Frank was instrumental in creating, the nacho dispenser that you see today in the bags, as opposed to those number 10 cans. And at one point, it was gravity fed. And then, we worked to create a peristaltic pump that actually pulls the cheese out of those bags. And so we were more sanitary. It's cleaner. It's safer. That's just one of the many things. I know back in the day, Coca-Cola was sold in what we called premix 5-gallon tanks. And then we went to post-mix. And now you can see, with, what Coca-Cola's done with their technology. So, everything is about evolution and change and development. And, Frank was definitely an entrepreneur. He was very creative. And again, he wanted to make it easier for everyone to sell whatever concession items they had. I mean, I'm talking about nacho cheese right now, but, he looked at adding jalapenos. He started ready-to-eat popcorn and was selling ready-to-eat popcorn in popcorn bags in grocery. So, he was way ahead of his time, way ahead of the curve.
Well, it's great to have you here to speak about all of your memories of working alongside him in the industry all these years. And you mentioned innovation, which is a big hallmark of exhibition as a whole. We know the impact, of course, that stadium seating has had, of recliners, digital projection. Let's not even get started on that, right? These big foundational moments. But when it comes to the concession space, what have been some of these innovations? And I know you just mentioned one a second ago, a couple of them with the nacho and the soda components. But from your perspective, what have been some of the tech or operational innovations that have most made a difference in the concessions game? Because, of course, you go back to the 80s and 70s, you don't have a point of sale system, right? You really have to manage inventory in a notebook. You have to manage sales and demand in very analog ways to the way we do it today.
Yeah, I think that technology, specifically with software, has really made a huge change. It's funny, I talked about carnies and gypsies, but I remember working in my first stadiums, and we literally had concession stands where you had a cigar box, and everything was priced, like on a quarter or a nickel, so that you didn't have to make change. And who knows where half the money went back in those days. But no, I think that specifically software technology. I mean, I remember in 2003, Malco was one of the first groups over at the Paradiso where we started using kiosk to order food. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of modeling a little bit behind, the Disney properties, and to see if we could get people to order food in advance. And, it didn't work so well because at the time, the financial equity was, it cost more for the technology and the implementation of the kiosk than what the return was. Now, we had a growth. We definitely saw at least a 10 to 12% increase in sales. But until we perfected and got the cost of the technology down, it didn't work. Now, look where we're at today. Now we're doing in-seat we're delivering food to the seat. Again, we're trying to find all the amenities we can to make it a pleasurable entertainment experience and better than what you would get at home. So I think the concession industry, and specifically in the theater industry, we're competing with other entertainment opportunities. And, you have to be on top of your game to find things that are unique and advantageous for the guest to use, your facilities.
Now, in the analog days, it's maybe a little bit more time intensive and organizationally challenging to wrap your head around the business. But today, even though we have all this technology, you also have much deeper menus. Larry, you have alcohol service, which is just exploding all over the country, just really rises everywhere in this, where, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like you guys are managing something much closer than a restaurant than to a snack shack that used to be in the 1970s and before.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful on that front. I think that every time you take, 2 steps forward, you probably have to take a step back. I think in the mid 2005 to 2010, we probably overemphasized big food in theaters specifically. Now, what stadiums have done in arenas, they figured out how to expand their menus, but they do it by having different stands, different locations to go and buy something. So one stand will, sell hamburgers, and the next stand will sell pizzas, and the next stand will sell deli sandwiches, and so forth and so on. So they can expand their menu, but they don't do it in one location. Movie theaters, tried to do that, and I think we found that the typical menu should be somewhere around 13 to 15 items. And so that's why I think hand-to-mouth food like pizzas, chicken tenders, and burgers work. Okay, that's adding some texture, right, to your offerings. But again, you can't offer everything. And if you do, everything gets diluted, and you don't have enough kitchen space, and the delivery just, the flow through, it just gets convoluted. It gets weighted. So I think we're better off. I think we've seen that we're better off, kind of managing it down to, about 15 items. I mean, the same thing happens on the alcohol side.
Right.
If you look at a bar menu, a bartender's recipe book, it could be 300 pages. But we know that people want vodka, they want tequila, they want about 2 or 3 different beers, a red wine, a white wine, a rosé, a sparkling wine. And, the simpler you keep it, the easier it is to manage.
Was it obvious that alcohol would be this great new frontier for the concessions business a number of decades back? Because it's really, I can speak on a personal level. Since I started covering this industry in 2013, it's been one of the biggest changes in American theaters. All the alcohol service that sprouted up seemingly out of nowhere. Did you guys anticipate it having this sort of impact?
If we go back to the 60s and 70s, the answer was no. I think as we progressed into the 2000s, I remember Malco was the first, our studio on the square was the first location in the state of Tennessee to serve beer and wine. And it was a real pain in the neck to get a license because it never happened before. And I think the greatest fear from outsiders was serving underaged guests. And so from that standpoint, it was always kind of frowned upon because we kind of looked at movie theaters as being for the teenagers and people under the age of 21. And what we forgot was those people that had turned, 18, 21, 22 were still going to the movies. And so we've kind of grown with our audience. And as they've aged, we've had to accommodate the needs of people that are in their 30s and 40s and 50s. And again, if you go to a baseball stadium, you can buy all the beer you want. You could go to the clubs and you could get your cocktail. And so what was the difference? The difference was, movie theaters just had to become more creative with their spaces and find room to do that. And we have.
I compare this business a lot to the evolution we've seen, not only in stadiums, but also airports. If you told someone that you would eat sushi in Yankee Stadium or LaGuardia Airport, which I've done at both locations, I think that they would have looked at you like you're insane, right? That's not something that you'd naturally assume. But we're seeing more and more that the American consumer is a lot more willing to be, let's say, a little bit more adventurous in their choices beyond just popcorn and candy. Which I don't mean to demean popcorn and candy at all. That's still the king and queen of this business, right?
Right. Well, I think the population that's attending movie theaters is more educated. They're more diverse. And, than they were back in the, I'll say, 60s and 70s. Because travel has become easier, more affordable, people have visited different regions. And so they learn things like, sushi. I remember in Seattle when the Seattle baseball stadium opened and they were selling sushi and everybody said, how's that going to work? Or even in San Diego, they were selling fish tacos. And we in the industry laughed and said, who in God's name is going to eat a fish taco at a baseball game, But then you see places like, Baltimore, when, they opened that ballpark and they started selling crab cakes and they couldn't keep them. And, San Francisco, I remember the stadium there, they sold garlic fries and you could smell the garlic, before you even got in the stadium because it was, permeating the air. So I think people have become, again, a lot of things have happened. The equipment, the evolution of the equipment and the ease, like a Turbo Chef, combo ovens where you can fix different types of food quickly, has helped in developing some of these specialized items that people sell. And everything is built to scale. So you talked about sushi at Yankee Stadium. Of course, New York City is the melting pot, right? But 50,000 people aren't going to eat sushi. But if you can get 1,000 people to eat sushi, then you can make some money, And so it's everything is built to scale. Everything is built to scale.
And it's catering to local tastes as well. I remember speaking to the head chef of Alamo Drafthouse a couple of years back, and they were telling me that their pizza sauce was too spicy for my Alamo location up in Yonkers, New York. That the Yonkers, New York clients were saying, you know what, this is too spicy for us. Whereas in Texas, down in Austin, where my sister lives, that wasn't ever an issue. So it's really just adjusting, especially right now, that it's just a much more national business than it used to be, adjusting to where you are in the country and where people have a predilection for certain foods.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak directly to that. There was a point in time when Malco wanted to move our hot dog to Nathan's Hot Dogs. I mean, Nathan's is famous, but Nathan's has a very specific recipe, and they have a lot of garlic in their hot dog and some spices. And when we introduced it, I mean, oh my gosh, our people in the Mid-South here just absolutely disliked our hot dogs, even though it was Nathan's, and everybody knows Nathan's brand. And so we now serve an Eisenberg hot dog that's all natural, and it has no chemicals, no nitrates, sulfates, no fillers. And so it's a softer, say less spicy type of hot dog. And so it fits for our region. Now, if I went to New York City or even Miami, Nathan's is going to, it's going to be the hot dog of choice.
Yeah, it all depends where you're from. And when you talk about those local choices, especially the way ballparks have done it, I think very strategically. And this is something that I'd love to see happen in the movie theater space. You can Google something like best concessions at insert ballpark, and you're going to find so many local choices, so many interesting things. Now, the concept here isn't to expand your menu to something that doesn't make sense, but maybe localizing that menu a little bit might be interesting for folks, because I can tell you that Cuban sandwich at the Miami Marlins Stadium, which is empty, so there's never a line to get anything you want. I used to go there a lot over the years. You can just walk through that concession stand without a problem. But there's some great experiences that you get when leaving the house, and your food order is part of that experience. I see that happening in the movie space a little bit. Of course, you've got the collectibles, the popcorn buckets, the drink toppers coming in. In your opinion, what is the industry doing to make the concessions part of the experience more of an event, the way that we've seen in stadiums?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I think the confection industry, the candy industry, is probably the best at creating new trends or fads. We remember E.T. and how Reese's Pieces almost went bankrupt. Hershey's almost canceled that, but that movie brought back a peanut butter candy. And I think even today we're looking at a freeze-dried candy that has taken off. I don't know if it's a fad, but the confection industry has certainly been, a leader in creating a new, I'm going to call it a new mouthfeel, something that you can enjoy. We've had Pop Rocks when we were kids. Those things exploded in your mouth, and that was fun. It wasn't so much about the sugar. It was just that, that pop, We
have the Dippin' Dots. That's another example, right?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Everybody was used to eating ice cream on a stick, and here Dippin' Dots comes along, and they make these little BBs, and exactly.
Now, I have to ask before we wrap up our interview, out of curiosity, you've traveled the world going to movie theaters. We traveled the world together, actually. I remember going to that Vista LATAM conference with you in Buenos Aires a couple of years back. You've seen so many different items on concession stand menus. What's the most exotic concession product you've seen in your career at a movie theater?
The one that leaves a lasting impression is fish balls. If you go to Asia, Bangkok or Hong Kong, Vietnam, they serve fish balls, which they look like dumplings. And I thought it'd be interesting to taste it. It has to be good, right?
Yeah,
everybody's eating it.
Oh my gosh. Obviously.
That, and then when I was in Istanbul, in Turkey, they serve boiled corn in a bowl. So it's like, here in the U.S., you would get a can of corn and put it in a pot and eat it as a side item with your dinner. Over there, it's in a crock pot and they just ladle it out into a bowl and hand it to you. So those two, fish balls and boiled corn.
And that was Larry Etter from Malco Theatres. Thank you so much for joining us, Larry. Earlier, you heard from my colleague, Chad Kennerk. And on behalf of myself, Daniel Loria, thank you very much for joining us here on the Box Office Podcast. We'll be back again next week with a new episode, I think taped live? Not really live. We're going to be pre-taping it from the trade show floor over at CineShow in Dallas, Texas with some special guests. So I'm looking forward to bringing that to you guys next week. In the meantime, don't forget to rate, subscribe, and recommend this podcast to your friends. It helps us doing this every single week. Thank you again for listening, and we will talk to you again next Thursday.